Whenever someone asks me what my favourite movie of all time is, my go-to answer is The Shining. Kubrick crafted one of my favourite pieces of media of all time, with a film that also includes possibly my favourite performance of all time. So when this trailer got released, I was obviously a little bit anxious. However, Mike Flannigan is one of my favourite directors working today. I've enjoyed basically everything he's done, in particular Haunting of Hill House, as well as Midnight Mass, and then of course Doctor Sleep. He just always comes out with a banger. It must be said though that I've never read The Shining or Doctor Sleep. Quite frankly, these days I'm not a massive reader altogether, but when I first heard of this, I wasn't sure if it was going to be just a standalone film with a vague background of the events of The Shining, but the use of music and that original Overlook Hotel made it apparent that this is going to be a continuation of the character of Dan Torrance. Continuing characters from a film that I consider to be essentially perfect is a bold move. So this film had a lot riding on it. Thankfully though, with Mike Flannigan at the helm, we ended up with a brilliant movie in its own right, as well as a great mirror to The Shining. Film that allows The Shining's legacy to stay unaffected and shine on. The film expands the world of The Shining without affecting Kubrick's movie. The only way this film touches the original is by basically asking you to believe that the events of that movie are paranormal, which I don't really think is a negative, because I know a lot of intrigue for The Shining is the kind of idea that Jack could be just going insane and that there's no actual supernatural elements. I personally have always believed that, yeah, there is supernatural stuff going on in that movie, and I think Jack Torrance is also just going insane, and it's a result of him being the bad father and bad person that he clearly is. And the only thing that this film asks you to accept is that there was some supernatural force in that hotel, which I don't think is a stretch, because that movie establishes The Shining, that ability, which is a supernatural element. But I think the film stands alone as a story as well. Despite being set in the world of The Shining, it's a story told outside of the isolated Overlook. I'll also be referring to the director's cut for this video, because to me it is the superior version. It's a whole ass extra like half an hour that I think is pretty much all great stuff. It fleshes out Abra and her parents, it expands Dan's arc, and also adds a lot to the True Knot, making them more threatening, and also more context to things throughout the film that, for me, just creates the best version of the movie.
We don't end, Charlie. I know that for certain. I don't know much else, but I know that we don't end.
Now, without further ado, the opening establishes the tone and what to expect so well. Rose the Hat is great, and the villains are one of the highlights of the film for me. They're some of my recent favourite horror villains. They look human, but they're so much closer to animals in every other way. It's hinted at when our protagonists are speaking about them, but also just their performances. They're so animalistic, they're so predatorial, and they feed off shine, which comes out as steam. Eating the steam allows them to stay young and powerful for generations. Explaining the True Knot as people who eat shine, whereas the Overlook was a place that ate it, is a really neat way to tie the films together, as well as just making this a grander story. The rest of the Shining elements are tied in through the trauma of Dan and his backstory, and in the way that they're used in this film, you can understand it without having seen The Shining. But as I say, the opening scenes establish the tone and what the film is very effectively. We open with Rose the Hat talking to Violet and obviously taking her, so in its first scene, it's showcasing that this is a world outside of the Overlook. This is going to be very different. We spent the entirety of The Shining in the Overlook pretty much. The only time we saw outside was them travelling there and Dick in his bedroom. And then we see the flashback of Danny arriving at room 237 that makes the firm connection to Kubrick's masterpiece. We see the state of the Torrances that were torn apart and the trauma that they both have, and this is expanded on as we go along in the film and explains how Dan ended up where he was at the start of the film. And that's really the core of the movie, overcoming this trauma and fear. I love how they bring Dick back in this movie though. He obviously died in The Shining, but they bring him back as a ghost essentially. This scene also gives us an insight into how Danny is feeling and how the Overlook really affected him.
I won't shine, no more. It's dangerous.
I love all of this. It's perfect setup for the rest of the movie, and it expands upon the ability of The Shining so well. This film has much more to do with The Shining than The Shining did, and it sets up Dan's character arc really well. Speaking of, he's in a bit of a state where we find him when we cut to him years later. He's an alcoholic, getting into bar fights, the whole lot. Clearly not dealing with his trauma the best way, not even having a place to stay, just sleeping on streets. The first thing we really see him do is steal money from a woman that he slept with, who is also a mother to a young child, so not the nicest stuff to do. And he uses that money to just travel as far as possible. He literally just says, however far this money takes me. Just getting as far away as he can from his actions, but also from the Overlook. During that bar fight, Dan says, "Are you going to take your medicine?" whilst hammered and beating this guy near enough to death. And later in the film, Lloyd, the bartender, would repeat this back to him.
Hey, you're gonna take your medicine. So tell me, pup, are you gonna take your medicine?
Around this time is when Rose the Hat discovers Snake by Andy, who provides our gateway into the True Knot as she is recruited, so to speak, which presents them as this tight family, this collective of people who are really more animalistic than anything. It's so apparent in their movements, and it makes it very clear that these things aren't human. They are devoid of any real humanity, and if they'd found Dan at this period, then it would have been game over. But because he chose not to use his shine growing up, then he was able to go unnoticed. And also the fact that he became an alcoholic and drank, it's revealed later on that drinking can dampen your shining ability. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that they eat shine is what allows them to live for generations and whatnot. But that's also how they can get away with taking these children and killing them. They've just got connections everywhere. They've been around for so long that they've got connections in the police, in lots of different areas, that they can just not be noticed at all. Also, remember that woman that Dan slept with? Yeah, her and her child died soon after Dan took the money. So that's kind of a lot to deal with, and that pushes Dan over the line to accept he needs help. He finally acknowledges it, and he talks to Billy, who is someone who's taken him in this new town, and he realizes that his consequences are catching up with him. Abra had her first interaction with Dan when she uses her shine to write hello on Dan's wall, and we are seeing how Abra's parents really aren't coping well with how she is showing her abilities, because she is shining incredibly bright, which is why the True Knot become interested when they get a sniff later in the movie. But the introduction of Abra I find really compelling. It's perfectly framed to see her parents' point of view and how they are scared out of love for their daughter, but also shows the character of Abra really well. But after Dan gets introduced to the town and everything, he begins his journey. We travel 8 years later. A sober man making a speech about his dad, which I know can be seen as contradictory for a lot of people, because it seems from the beginning of The Shining that Jack's not a great person anyway, which I do believe is the intention, and that's how I see it. But I still think it makes sense for Dan to be saying this, because it was his dad, and he still looked up to him and loved him, despite everything.
Daddy tried to kill me.
It wasn't all him. You gotta know that place fed his dark like it fed on your light. And he had some light in him too. Just like you got some dark. We all got both.
He knew his dad was an alcoholic, and so I really have no problem with it. But it also sets up later on how Dan still is yet to confront the trauma that has kind of been caused by his own father. He's not really there yet. Yes, he's had a great journey and is 8 years sober, but he's not quite done yet.
I'm thinking about my dad. I saw a chip like this in his hand once. A couple of months before he died. 5-month chip, I'm pretty sure. 'Cause the drinking and the temper and the anger, those things in me were his, and they were all I could know of him. Well, now I get to know him a little different, 'cause he also stood in a room like this once, wanting to get well for me and my mom. And he held a chip in his hand, and that chip said 5 months. And on that day, before it all, well, on that day, all he wanted in the world was to stand where I'm standing now. And here I am. So thank you for us both, I guess. This is for Jack Torrance.
Now obviously there's a lot going on here, and we've been following Dan and the True Knot as well as coming back to Abra, but now we reach where all these points are going to start converging in. The True Knot have found another boy who has the shine, notably being used in his baseball games where he's just kicking ass. So they track him down, and in an absolutely brutal scene they murder the baseball boy, inflicting as much pain as possible.
Are you gonna hurt me?
Yeah. Pain purifies steam. Fear too, so you understand.
And Abra, using her shine as she sleeps, sees what happens to the boy and feels it so hard that she shakes the entire street. The residents think it was a local earthquake, but it even reaches to Dan. Smashing the word murder into his wall, which he sees in the reflection of his mirror as red rum. A complete reverse of how it was in The Shining, and it's a brilliant scene, and it's brutal how the True Knot devour his shine, but Rose feels Abra watching, and so now they've kind of got her scent. So with this, Abra seeks out Dan in person, except to her disappointment, Dan feels rather than looking further, the best bet is for her to stay out of the way and avoid these people, because that's what he did. But Abra, being Abra, decides to look into Rose the Hatmore herself with some really spectacular visuals, but in doing that, Rose is able to look straight back. But as soon as Rose tries to go into Abra's mind, Abra blows her out massively, and so they realise how powerful that she is, because Rose is an incredibly powerful individual herself. So the fact that Abra, a child,
You're just a fucking child!
has this much power means that she's going to have a lot of steam for the True Knot to eat. So now they're thinking of either turning her to one of them, or they just keep her and just continuously take steam when they want it, just dragging her life out to eat every last bit of steam. And plus now she knows where she lives, so the stakes of the story are rising. Later on, Rose tries to get back into Abra's mind to really identify where she is and get an idea of how to get to her, but Abra set a trap and hurts Rose even worse, completely mangling her hand.
Mike Flannigan gets his famous destroyed hand sequence. It's an honour to have your hand savaged in a Mike Flannigan film.
What I hadn't mentioned is that Dan has taken up working in the hospital just as a janitor, but has ended up comforting patients who are about to pass. The cat, Azzy, always seems to know and sits on the patient's beds, and shortly after they always seem to pass. Somehow the cat always knows. And Dan found himself trying to take Azzy off the bed, but the patient informs him that he knows now he's going to pass because Azzy's sat on the end of his bed, and he ends up sitting with them and comforting them in their final moments as they're fearing about what's next. These are some of my favourite scenes in the movie. Dan using his shine to comfort people as they're just fearing what's next for them, what's afterlife Is there anything more? Is it just pitch black? Is it just going to sleep? Do you feel anything? All these things, and Dan is just doing his best to comfort these people. And they're such small moments, but they go a real long way. And it also leans into the idea of lots of people having a bit of shine without even knowing, including Azzy the cat, it is implied. Dan helping others confront death arriving at their doorstep, I think, lends to part of the reason the ending works so well for me. Dan being able to accept where he is at the end of the movie because he's helped so many others and he finally was able to reach that point himself at the end. But one of these nights in the hospital, Dick shows up saying that it's going to be his last visit to Dan, but essentially telling him that Rose has noticed Abra and that she needs his help. So Dan is kind of forced into Dick's role from The Shining now, and with that, Abra finds out where the boy was killed, and Dan and Billy go out to see if she's right, and sure thing, she was. The True Knot are now getting more desperate. Grandpa Flick has cycled in a scary sequence showcasing how they haven't been eating well, and if they're not eating well, then they're going to die. And even amongst the sadness of losing one of their own, their irresistible animalistic instinct kicks in as soon as he passes, and they eat all the remains of his steam. But Dan, Billy, and Abra, and Abra's dad, come up with a plan which allows them to take out the members of the True Knot with guns, and this scene feels really out of place to me, if I'm honest. It just feels like such a sudden jump, and maybe we should have just had a scene of them discussing their options here. I think it attempts to justify it when Billy talks about using rifles to shoot deer, and with the True Knot's close comparison to being animals as opposed to humans, I think that's meant to be the justification, but for me, it still just doesn't totally fit. But despite things seemingly going well, Snakebite Andy forces Billy to shoot himself, and Crow Daddy went on his own to drug and take Abra, also killing her dad in the process. And yeah, there's a bit of a continuity error where Abra's dad isn't in the background of the scene in the director's cut of this. Yeah, it is a bit strange. Not the best time to take a pee break. So it took a pretty harsh left turn pretty quickly, and Dan is obviously pretty fucking panicked. He immediately goes back to try and drink. That's all he wants. He just wants to run again from everything going on in his life, but he finds the strength to resist. And uses his shine in a really great scene to connect with Abra and take over her position, meeting Crow Daddy and swerving his car, killing him, leaving Rose the Hat the sole survivor of the True Knot and also extremely pissed.
You little bitch.
So now we enter the mental third act of the movie.
Man takes a drink. The drink takes a drink. And then the drink takes a man.
We return to the Overlook Hotel because Dan thinks since it's dangerous for people like him and Abra, it's probably dangerous for people like them. This is where the movie kind of shows its hand to me, and I guess really lays out the themes and shows how it continues The Shining, a film about abuse of multiple kinds, a family falling apart, isolation, so much horror, and then this film is that trauma and overcoming it. Now, a massive thing I hear about this part of the movie is that it's too fan servicey, and you're probably right, to be honest. We replay quite a few moments, but I fucking love it. It gives a justification for Dan walking around. I mean, this hotel has been abandoned for God knows how long, and so yeah, he would have to wake it up. That makes sense. This is a supernatural location. But there's multiple reasons why I think this works, and the main one is, up until this point, we've been focusing on a story far apart from The Shining. This is an entirely different movie, just set with the backstory of The Shining. And the events of the Overlook being a part of Dan's trauma, us as viewers, since most of us have seen The Shining, we've just got more context for it. We've got that wider view. We've seen flashbacks, which I don't need to explain the use of flashbacks, but they give brief glimpses into the actual moments. And then we've got quite a few background references throughout the film that I feel serve to show the path that Dan is so close to going down. Like such as the office looking like the interview office in the Overlook, then seeing red rum in the reflection and wearing similar clothes to Jack by the end, but just in blue. I think all of this is showcasing how close Dan is to ending up more like Jack, but he's fighting off that trauma, and that's what I mean by earlier saying he's not really dealt with specifically his memory of his dad and how he caused a lot of that trauma. But despite that, the film has been entirely its own thing. But that's the reason for including these things, and yeah, it is also a bit of fun, but there's reason, there's meaning behind it. And so now, for us as Shining fans, we've been watching this film and we've got invested in these characters and this wider world, and so now we're returning where all that trauma started, and so it's like, okay, we spent 2.5 hours seeing all of this shit, now we're gonna repay you and throw all of the coolest shit you've ever seen. I love the design so much of the hotel, I can never complain about it, and they perfectly recreated it. It's so impressive, and I think it totally makes sense in the world and thematically. Dan is having to go back and dig down really within himself to his darkest place to overcome that trauma. I absolutely love the bar scene that comes after Dan has given us the tour, and this gives the closure between Dan and his memory of his dad, while simultaneously keeping the horror of this world intact. Lloyd the bartender, I need like all of his quotes on a t-shirt, I swear.
A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Mr. Torrance. What'll it be?
But it doesn't explicitly say that Lloyd was Jack's dad in The Shining. I personally believe that it's the Overlook just trying to break Dan with his most painful memories and using his dad to try and convince him to drink, to fall down that path. It is, as we kind of got hinted at in The Shining, of how it happened with Grady before Jack, and then it happened with Jack, and now it's happening again with Dan, or that's what the hotel wants. In the director's cut, earlier in the movie, at the start of one of the chapters, we also saw a shot of the hotel, the ballroom, just being empty, but with a glass of whiskey, obviously waiting for Dan. So the setup was there, we know that they've been waiting. And that's what I mean about how it keeps The Shining intact, because ultimately it's a film that sets itself apart in the story alone, but then adds in the expansion of The Shining and look more into those supernatural elements of the world. And it asks you to get on board with that early, and normally I wouldn't, because The Shining is so perfect in its own right, and part of the reason it works is because we have no answers to the horror that takes place. But this also doesn't give you any of those answers, and it's not trying to, and it's not trying to be The Shining, and it's not trying to be better. It's worked into the story and the themes. It is Dan's trauma. To me, this bar scene acts as Dan's closure, pretty much for his memory of his father, who, as we all kind of know, wasn't the best dad. This scene acts as his confrontation to what Jack actually was to him, that memory of his alcoholic, abusive father. Another thing that I failed to mention earlier was when talking about that bar scene, Dan tells Lloyd that he sees death flies, and did a lot as a kid. Whenever someone was getting close to their death, he'd start to see flies covering them, and as Wendy neared her death, that happened to her, but so much so that Dan couldn't even look at her because her face was just covered in flies. He just couldn't look her in the eyes. But the worst thing was that Wendy couldn't look back at Dan, because every time that she looked at Dan, she saw Jack. And we actually see this happen briefly in the director's cut. It's never seen in the theatrical, it's only spoken about, but we actually see a flashback of this happening. And it's really tough. As the movie goes on, they defeat Rose. She's taken by the demons of the Overlook that have been released from Dan's memories.
What's in those? Something special, huh?
They're not special. They're starving.
But they also take him, again showing if he lets his demons take a hold of him that he's going to end up more like his father.
Hello, Danny.
But he fights. He saves Abra, giving his life to do so, conquering the demons that have been plaguing his life for such a long time. When Dan arrived, the first thing he did was go to the boiler room, which has now begun to set the hotel ablaze. This is where Dan stays. This is where he accepts. He's moved past his demons, he's fought them and won. And he's now ready for the next step of his life, where him and Wendy can finally see each other face to face again, both young and healthy, and it's such a great ending. We see the Overlook engulfed in flames, finally cleansed of all the horror that's taken place on these grounds and all the trauma that Dan has experienced here. All the fears that Dan has had becoming his father, just all of that painful memory and the fear of death and what's after that, all culminates in this ending that allows Dan peace, finally. The following scene with Abra talking to Dan in her bedroom is a really nice bookend to the movie, Dan becoming a ghost the same as Dick, and clearly finally at peace after seeing him throughout the movie in anything but that. Abra is also now having to start deal with her own trauma from the events of this movie. Crow Daddy killed her father, and she experienced everything in the Overlook as well. She now begins her journey of dealing with everything that she's experienced. Dr. Sleep is a great movie in its own right, as well as being a mirror to The Shining. As much as there is unquestionably fan service in the film, this is a good way to do fan service in my opinion.
Great party, isn't it?
It's not constant things being thrown at the screen for us to say, look, we know that from the other movie. There's only a couple moments that I felt were unearned, and the only main one was in the director's cut where Dan and Lloyd go into the bathroom and we see the red walls and everything, and that didn't feel like a necessary addition. I know he goes on like a tour of the Overlook and like he goes to the door that had the axe go through it and all of that, but I've already explained why this all works for me, because there is actual purpose. I think the entire cast do a great job. Kylie Curran gives one of, if not perhaps the greatest child performance in a movie I've ever seen, and I think it's the best performance in this film. Ewan McGregor is a great choice for Dan and portrays the trauma and fear so well. Rebecca Ferguson is just phenomenal as Rose the Hat. Then Carl Lumley taking over Dick, Alex Esso taking on Wendy, and Henry Thomas taking on Lloyd / Jack Torrance.
Danny boy!
They're all so good, all having to fill some very iconic shoes, and Alex Esso as Wendy is the perfect choice. I mean, she is spot on to Shelley Duvall's performance, and Carl Lumley does just as good of a job as carrying on Scatman Crothers' performance as Dick.
Mike Flannigan calls me and says, I have a part for you, but I understand if you don't want to do it. And he said, I want you to play Jack Torrance. I said, well, are you sure you want to cast me in that role? He said, do you want to do it? I said, yes. He said, perhaps now we should discuss what we're going to do with your hairline. I said, okay, it's all right, Mike. I'm on board.
Now straying a bit more into the actual production of this movie, because it's all really interesting to me. Mike Flannigan is a braver man than me for taking this on, adapting the Dr. Sleep book, which is a sequel to The Shining book, both by the legendary Stephen King, but the problem being that Stephen King fucking hated Kubrick's Shining because it was just so different to his book.
Jack Nicholson in The Shining, were you pleased with that?
I thought he did a wonderful job in Shining. Enjoyed it very much.
How did you feel about the movie itself?
Well, I feel both ways. I got to see it 4 times because of commitments one place and another. And there are an awful lot of things about that movie that I think are flawless and beautiful and just marvelous. And then there are other times when I feel as though I'd given Stanley Kubrick a live grenade and he heroically threw his body on it.
The book was warm and the movie was cold. It was a Kubrick film. And don't get me wrong, I love everything else the man did. I just didn't like that one.
So how on earth do you tackle this? Because, like in the book, Dick doesn't die in The Shining, but he does in the movie. The Overlook burns down at the end of The Shining book. But also, do you make this movie a sequel to Kubrick's movie? Because that movie just feels so untouchable. So this film both adapts the sequel book, as well as acting as a sequel to Kubrick's movie, as well as bringing in more of King's original ideas from The Shining book into this film, which really gives it its own identity. Flannigan focuses on the personal horror in everything that he does, the horror in your mind, and that's why he's one of my favourites working today. Flannigan has a perfect understanding of Kubrick's work as well as King's respectively, and just has the utmost respect for both, which I think he showcases in this film.
And you think about what happens to people when they die in the Overlook Hotel. They're staff now. Now we're not even talking about someone coming in to try to play Nicholson or to play the part the way Nicholson approached it. This is a whole other expression of Jack Torrance, and it's one that abides perfectly by the rules that Kubrick set out himself.
I think you've mistaken me for someone else.
The demons that are inside, and he brings them to life in such interesting ways to me. The film is covered in these blue tones, as well as a lot of his work is, and that keeps the tone quite somber to me and makes you conscious of the underlying themes of the film. Also making that shot of the Overlook in flames even more powerful, having the bright orange shoot through the dark. Doctor Sleep for me is a great sequel and just an all-round great movie, and in my opinion deserves more praise than it gets. It's a very different movie to The Shining, although the director's cut does go at a more similar pace. It does slow down the movie quite a lot, but like I say, I think it's for the better. And the brilliant soundtrack transforms the horrific noises from The Shining into themes in this film that are really goosebump inducing, that lie under the visuals and add to the feeling in every scene. If you haven't watched Doctor Sleep, I highly recommend giving it a watch and checking out more of Mike Flannigan's work.
Shine on, Abra Stone. You shine on.